What if I told you that one of Africa's most overlooked and economically challenging nations just paid off nearly $5 billion in debt without a single dollar from the IMF, the World Bank, or any Western lender? Sounds impossible, doesn't it? And yet, that's exactly what Burkina Faso has done. A landlocked nation is often dismissed as too poor to stand alone, just rewrote the rules of modern economics. With unwavering resolution and bold leadership under President Ibrahim Traoré, this West African country took its destiny into its own hands and shattered the myth that Africa must always be dependent on Western aid to survive. This isn't just a financial success story, it's a political revolution. It's a statement to the world that a new Africa is rising strong, sovereign, and unafraid. If you've ever wondered whether African nations could break free from the grip of debt and dependence, this story is your answer. In early 2024, the world heard something they never expected. Dr. Apollinaire Guillaume de Tambela, Prime Minister of Burkina Faso, made a historic announcement. The country had fully repaid $4.79 billion in domestic debt. No external bailouts, no IMF rescue packages, no Western conditions or oversight. It was a stunning declaration that made the global financial community pause. Not because the amount was the largest ever seen, but because of who did it and how. Burkina Faso, a country that's often described as one of the poorest in Africa, had just done what wealthier, more stable nations often fail to do: clear its national debt using only internal resources. No media pleas for foreign support, no GoFundMe diplomacy with Paris or Washington. Instead, there was quiet planning, deep resilience, and a belief that Burkina Faso could fund its own future on its own terms. This move was more than financial, it was a political act of defiance. It sent a clear message to the international community: we are no longer playing by your rules. And perhaps even more shocking, it worked. Burkina Faso's decision to rely solely on domestic capital markets at a time when the country was under sanctions and political pressure has sparked what some call the beginning of Africa's financial reawakening. It wasn't just about paying the bills, it was about reclaiming control of money, of dignity, and of the national story itself. So how exactly did Burkina Faso manage to repay nearly $5 billion in domestic debt without foreign aid? The answer begins with a bold decision. Instead of chasing after international loans with strings attached, President Ibrahim Traoré's administration chose a radically different path, one rooted in national dignity and financial sovereignty. They decided to fund their debt using local capital, tapping into the wealth, trust, and rising pride of their own people. The government issued bonds, but not to the World Bank or foreign investors. These were domestic bonds, offered to local banks, pension funds, businesses, and even individuals. They called on Burkinabe citizens to believe in something greater than politics, to invest in the future of their own country. At first, the idea sounded risky. After all, Burkina Faso was still facing security threats from insurgent groups, and its economy was considered fragile by global institutions. Most experts believed that investor flight was inevitable. But something remarkable happened. Not only did they stay, they invested. Why? Because the government didn't just ask for money. It showed fiscal discipline, transparency, and a clear vision for infrastructure development. For the first time in decades, the people saw a leadership that wasn't beholden to foreign donors, but accountable to its own citizens. This shift created what economists might call a confidence surge, but what ordinary Burkinabe would call something far simpler: hope. Hope that their money wouldn't be swallowed by corruption. Hope that their investments would build roads, hospitals, and schools. Hope that Burkina Faso could rise on its own. By trusting in its people, the government flipped a long-standing narrative that African nations must rely on the West to survive. Burkina Faso showed that homegrown solutions are not only possible, they're powerful. While Burkina Faso was mobilizing local capital, the country was still navigating a storm. The Sahel region remained a hotbed of insurgent activity. Political uncertainty lingered after the 2022 military-led transition. Western media called the situation unstable, and foreign investors quietly stepped back. Under these circumstances, most nations would panic and reach for external help, but President Ibrahim Traoré's government did the opposite. They stayed the course, and instead of hiding the nation's problems, they addressed them head-on. Through clear public communication, strict fiscal accountability, and relentless engagement with domestic institutions, the leadership built something rare in moments of crisis: trust. Key institutions like banks, pension funds, and national savings programs were encouraged, not forced, to invest in government bonds. And they did. Why? Because the government was transparent about where the money would go and how it would be used. Even as the international community applied pressure and sanctions, investor confidence remained remarkably high. There were no capital flight events, no bank collapses, no protests over missing funds. In fact, local businesses started reinvesting not just in bonds, but in infrastructure projects that would support their own long-term success. This wasn't just policy, it was strategy, a quiet revolution in economic thinking. The government understood that for a domestic market to function in the face of conflict, it needed something more powerful than contracts or interest rates. It needed trust between the state and its people. In most African nations under siege, people withdraw. They hold their savings tight. But in Burkina Faso, people leaned in. They saw that the administration wasn't just fighting extremists in the north, it was fighting a deeper war against the mindset of dependency. And somehow, they were winning. Still, Burkina Faso's greatest challenge didn't come from within, but from those outside its borders who didn't want this model to succeed. When news broke that Burkina Faso had cleared nearly $5 billion in debt without IMF support, the reaction from the global financial order was not celebration, it was suspicion. Quiet meetings began happening across major Western institutions. Analysts scrambled to explain how a country like Burkina Faso, a nation they had written off as economically fragile, had done what even middle-income nations struggled to achieve. Because if Burkina Faso could succeed using local capital without IMF loans or World Bank oversight, what message would that send to other African nations still trapped under decades of interest payments and structural adjustment programs? The fear wasn't just about money, it was about losing control. The IMF made no public congratulations, no official acknowledgement of the debt clearance. Instead, they quietly tightened conditions on neighboring Sahel nations. Western commentators began questioning the sustainability of Burkina Faso's strategy. Some hinted at hidden support from Russia or China, others accused the government of risking inflation or default, but none of those fears materialized. What did happen, however, was a wave of international pressure. Burkina Faso began facing sanctions, reduced aid packages, and diplomatic cold shoulders. Invitations to regional economic forums were lost. Foreign NGOs pulled out their funding. Western media coverage shifted tone from cautious interest to outright skepticism. The message was clear: you can succeed but not without us. But this time, Traoré stood firm, saying, "We don't need permission to stand on our own feet." This quiet defiance sparked conversations across Africa, from Mali to Niger, from Ghana to Ethiopia. Could more nations follow this path? Was the Western-led debt system finally being exposed as a tool of control? Burkina Faso had not just paid a debt, it had broken an unspoken rule. Don't prove the old system is unnecessary. But the story doesn't end there, because what came next shook the entire geopolitical landscape. As the news of Burkina Faso's financial self-liberation spread, something rare began to happen. Other African nations started asking questions, not just quietly in closed-door ministries, but publicly. From Mali and Niger, both countries also led by transitional military governments, came praise and emulation. Economists in Ghana, Kenya, and South Africa began referencing Burkina Faso's debt exit as a potential parallel model, to traditional Bretton Woods financing. Even regional blocs like ECOWAS, once critical of the Traoré administration, began softening their tone. But the most surprising shift came from within civil society, not just in Africa, but globally. African youth on social media celebrated Traoré as a financial liberator. Diaspora communities in the US, UK, and France began organizing webinars, fundraising initiatives, and think tanks around alternative African development paths. Pan-Africanist scholars hailed Burkina Faso's move as the first modern breakaway from neo-colonial economics. Meanwhile, Washington, D.C. took notice. While official U.S. statements remained neutral, intelligence reports and policy briefings began flowing through the State Department. Think tanks like the Council on Foreign Relations and Brookings Institution published cautious analyses titled Burkina Faso's Debt Gamble and The Rise of Sovereign Financing in the Sahel. Behind closed doors, U.S. diplomats asked African allies, "Can we trust Traoré? Is Burkina Faso becoming a proxy for non-Western powers?" What they feared most wasn't that Traoré had turned to Russia or China. What they feared was that he hadn't needed to. Burkina Faso was becoming a symbol of radical independence, not through ideology or weapons, but through numbers, policy, and courage. And that kind of leadership doesn't stay isolated, it inspires. The West knew that if this story spread unchecked, the IMF's leverage across Africa could collapse, and with it, decades of influence. So while the public message was silence or skepticism, the private message was alarm. And yet, the most unexpected twist was still to come, one that would elevate Traoré from reformer to revolutionary icon. In Washington, London, and Brussels, Burkina Faso's financial independence triggered quiet anxiety, not because it posed a military threat, but because it exposed a philosophical vulnerability. For decades, the prevailing narrative in Western policy circles was simple: Africa is not ready to go it alone. The continent, we were told, needed supervision, structural reform, and Western loans to survive. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank were sold to the public as lifelines, when in reality, they often became leashes. And then came Burkina Faso. This wasn't a story of sudden oil wealth or foreign bailouts. This was a country under intense pressure and isolation that had cut its debt, realigned its economy, and walked away from dependency on its own terms. For the American foreign policy establishment, the implications were sobering. If Burkina Faso succeeds, who's next? Would Niger, also under a nationalist junta, follow suit? Would countries like Uganda, Zambia, or even South Africa begin questioning the logic of borrowing with conditions? Could Africa, for the first time in modern history, negotiate with the West as equals, not beggars? This was not the Africa the G7 was prepared for. Think tanks in Washington issued quiet warnings. If Burkina Faso's story goes viral, we could lose the next generation of African partnerships. Media outlets like the New York Times and BBC ran features with subtle undertones, praising Burkina Faso's courage, but also questioning its sustainability. Phrases like populist experiment, dangerous nationalism, and shadow influence began creeping into headlines. In diplomatic circles, pressure was applied subtly. Suspended trade benefits, visa restrictions for key officials, travel advisories for NGOs and investors. And yet nothing stuck. Traoré refused to lash out. He remained calm, measured, and unwavering. He gave few interviews, but when he spoke, he chose his words with care. Burkina Faso is not anti-West, but we are pro-dignity. For American observers, the real threat wasn't in Traoré's resistance, it was in his results. What began as a national decision in Burkina Faso soon echoed across continents. In Latin America, economists in Bolivia and Argentina referenced the Traoré model as proof that small nations could push back against global financial orthodoxy. In Southeast Asia, academics in Indonesia and Malaysia began revisiting post-colonial economic theory. Even in Europe, Voices on the political fringe, both left and right, cited Burkina Faso's independence as a challenge to EU centralism and the stranglehold of the Eurozone. But the biggest tremor came from within Africa itself. In Pan-African forums, from Addis Ababa to Lagos, a phrase emerged again and again: if Burkina Faso can do it, why not us? The old belief that the IMF was the only path to stability was beginning to crack. Young Africans, often educated abroad, began returning home not with Western models, but with local blueprints. Sovereignty was no longer just a flag or a border. It was a budget, a loan, a choice. And for the first time in decades, Africa had a living example. Burkina Faso's shift didn't just challenge economics, it redefined power. Global investors began reassessing the Sahel. International lending institutions saw increased default risks, not because of mismanagement, but because of a rising refusal to play by old rules. A new generation of African leaders was watching Traoré carefully, not to mimic his uniform, but to understand his independence. And as the world recalibrated, one truth became clear. This was no longer just about Burkina Faso. This was about the global South, claiming its voice no in protest, but in policy. In this new game, Ibrahim Traoré wasn't merely surviving. He was setting the rules. In a stunning turn of events, reports surfaced in early 2025 that sent shockwaves through international finance. The International Monetary Fund quietly approached Burkina Faso with a proposal not of enforcement, but of cooperation. Yes, the same institution that had once demanded structural reforms, privatizations, and austerity from African nations was now proposing a bilateral economic forum with Ouagadougou. Why? Because the numbers told a story they could no longer ignore. Despite sanctions and international skepticism, Burkina Faso's GDP had stabilized. Its inflation rate dropped below 6%, and local currency usage had risen by over 40% in rural regions. The agricultural program, fueled by tens of thousands of military farmers, was outperforming projections. And crucially, the country's youth unemployment fell for the first time in a decade. From Washington to Paris, the narrative began to shift, not out of goodwill, but out of necessity. Burkina Faso had done the unthinkable. It didn't just survive outside the system. It functioned. It improved. It inspired. When the IMF requested a meeting, President Ibrahim Traoré reportedly gave a three-word reply: "We will listen." That reply was not submission. It was strength. It meant that for the first time, the conversation was being held on African terms. It was the moment when the colonized no longer had to ask, but were finally being asked. With the IMF's unexpected outreach, Ibrahim Traoré's leadership took on a new dimension. He was no longer just a national figure, but a beacon of African self-determination. His refusal to bow under Western pressure, combined with Burkina Faso's tangible economic success, made him a rallying point for millions across the continent. African leaders, activists, and intellectuals began invoking Traoré's name as a symbol of what bold, homegrown leadership could achieve. Songs were composed, speeches delivered, and grassroots movements mobilized around the idea that Africa could rewrite its future. Traoré's government used this momentum wisely. Instead of aggressive confrontation, they promoted a message of unity and renewal alone that invited other African nations to consider sovereignty not as rebellion, but as responsibility. At key summits, Traoré called for regional financial cooperation, investment in local markets, education, and youth empowerment. These were not just slogans, they were strategic blueprints grounded in Burkina Faso's lived experience. Global media started to portray Traoré not as a disruptive insurgent, but as a visionary reformer challenging the outdated global order. Even some Western politicians began cautiously admiring his courage, recognizing that Africa's future lay in leaders who embraced self-reliance rather than dependence. The stage was set for a new chapter in African politics zone, where leaders like Ibrahim Traoré would be seen as champions of dignity and economic freedom. His story was no longer just Burkina Faso's. It was Africa's story. It was a story of awakening, and it had only just begun. Burkina Faso's journey, from debt-ridden nation to financial trailblazer, is more than a story of numbers. It's a testament to what happens when a country believes in itself. Today, Burkina Faso stands reborn, its people empowered, its economy resilient, its future bright. President Ibrahim Traoré's words echo loudly across the continent. We do not ask for permission to be free. We rise and claim our freedom. This is the spirit Africa needs: courage, dignity, and unwavering faith in its own potential. If you feel moved by Burkina Faso's bold stand and want to see more stories of African strength and renewal, please share this video. Let's amplify the truth beyond the headlines. Subscribe to our channel to join the journey of uncovering Africa's untold stories of resilience, leadership, and hope. Together, we can support a future where Africa no longer bows but leads. God bless Burkina Faso. God bless Africa.